Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her grip on the CheyTac M200 as Colonel Bradley walked past her position on the firing range without so much as a glance at her custom rifle setup. She had spent months modifying the weapon system and perfecting her long-range calculations, but the old-school colonel had made it clear he didn't believe women belonged in sniper units. The other male snipers snickered as Bradley announced the upcoming qualification trials would separate the real marksmen. From the pretenders, Santos felt her jaw clench as she watched the colonel examine the men's equipment with genuine interest while completely dismissing her presence. But what the colonel didn't know was that Santos had been secretly training at distances far beyond the standard qualification requirements, and she had discovered something about her rifle that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nevada desert training facility as Santos methodically cleaned her rifle barrel for the third time that day, knowing that even microscopic debris could throw off a shot at extreme distances. She had arrived at the base 6 weeks earlier with orders that seemed routine on the surface, but carried classification, levels that made even the base commander nervous. The other snipers assumed she was just another diversity hire trying to prove herself in a man's world. But Santos carried secrets that would have shocked them into silence if they knew the truth. Her service record showed standard deployments and unremarkable achievements, but the redacted sections told a different story of operations that officially never happened. Colonel Bradley had built his reputation on traditional military values and old-fashioned discipline, believing that physical strength and aggressive tactics were the only qualities that mattered in combat. He looked at Santos and saw weakness where others might have recognized the calm focus of someone who had already proven herself in ways he couldn't imagine. The colonel had commanded sniper units for 15 years and prided himself on being able to spot talent within minutes of meeting a new recruit. But his prejudices had blinded him to the fact that Santos represented a new evolution in long-range warfare that made his methods seem primitive by comparison. Santos had spent the previous evening in her quarters studying meteorological data and calculating ballistic coefficients for shots that extended far beyond anything the base had ever attempted. The CheyTac M200 in her hands was not the standard military-issue weapon that appeared in the equipment logs, but rather a heavily modified system that incorporated experimental technology developed by a classified research division. The rifle featured a custom barrel manufactured to tolerances measured in fractions of thousandths of an inch and a scope system that could compensate for atmospheric conditions in real time using satellite data, feeds that most snipers didn't even know existed. The other members of her supposed training class had no idea that Santos had already completed advanced sniper schools that didn't appear on any official military education records. She had trained with instructors whose names were classified and had fired weapons that officially didn't exist while learning techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered physically possible. The 2850-meter badge hidden in her personal effects represented achievements that only a handful of people in the world had ever accomplished, but Santos wore it as a reminder of how much further she still had to go. As Colonel Bradley continued his inspection of the male snipers' equipment, Santos noticed how he praised their standard modifications and conventional approaches to long-range shooting without realizing that their techniques were already obsolete compared to what she had been taught. The colonel spoke about wind reading and range estimation as if these were still the primary challenges in precision shooting, but Santos had moved beyond such basic considerations into realms of ballistic science that treated every shot as a complex physics problem requiring computational solutions. The base armorer had questioned some of Santos' equipment requests, but her authorization codes had silenced his objections, even though he clearly didn't understand why anyone would need ammunition manufactured to such precise specifications, or why her rifle required components that cost more than most soldiers' annual salaries. Santos had simply smiled and explained that she liked to be thorough, knowing that the real explanation would have required security clearances that the armorer would never possess. During the previous week's training exercises, Santos had deliberately performed at levels that appeared competent but unremarkable, allowing the other snipers to maintain their assumptions about her capabilities while she secretly tested her equipment and refined her techniques for the demonstration she knew was coming. The colonel had scheduled the qualification trials as a way to prove his point about women in combat roles, but Santos intended to use the same event to deliver a message that would reshape his understanding of modern warfare. The wind patterns across the desert had become as familiar to Santos as her own heartbeat after weeks of careful observation, and she had identified atmospheric conditions that would create the perfect opportunity for her planned demonstration. The other snipers focused on standard qualification distances and conventional targets, but Santos had been preparing for something that would challenge the very limits of what the base thought was possible. As the sun climbed higher and the qualification day approached, Santos felt the familiar calm that came before moments that would change everything. She had faced similar situations before in places whose names she could never speak, and had learned that the most powerful weapon was often the element of surprise, combined with capabilities that exceeded every expectation. The colonel would soon discover that his assumptions about her were not just wrong, but dangerously outdated in a world where warfare was evolving faster than traditional military thinking could adapt. The CheyTac M200 rested against her shoulder like an extension of her own body as Santos prepared to show Colonel Bradley and everyone else on the base that the future of precision shooting had already arrived, and it looked nothing like what they expected. The qualification day arrived with brutal desert winds that had most snipers struggling to hit targets at 1,200 meters. But Santos remained calm as she watched her competitors miss shot after shot. Colonel Bradley stood behind the firing line with his arms crossed, clearly expecting her to fail like he believed all women would under pressure. When her turn came, Santos ignored the standard 1,200-meter target and instead requested permission to attempt the legendary 2850-meter shot that no one at the base had ever successfully completed. The colonel laughed and told her she could embarrass herself all she wanted, but his expression changed when Santos began making wind calculations that none of the other snipers understood. She chambered around and steadied her breathing as whispers spread through the crowd about what she was attempting to do. The desert. Wind howled across the firing range with gusts reaching 30 miles per hour, creating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. But Santos had been waiting for exactly these circumstances because she knew that extreme conditions would make her demonstration even more impressive. The other snipers had already packed up their equipment after failing to achieve qualifying scores on the standard targets, but Santos methodically unpacked additional gear that none of them recognized, including a tablet computer connected to her rifle scope through cables that seemed far too advanced for standard military equipment. Colonel Bradley watched with growing confusion as Santos began entering data into her tablet, while simultaneously adjusting her rifle scope in ways that defied conventional sniper training. The wind speed indicators on the range showed readings that should have made accurate shooting impossible, but Santos seemed to be using the harsh conditions as part of her calculations rather than fighting against them like everyone else had done. The base range master approached the colonel and quietly suggested that they should stop Santos before she wasted expensive ammunition on an impossible shot, but Bradley waved him away because he wanted to watch her fail spectacularly. In front of the entire unit, Santos pulled out a small device that looked like a miniature weather station and held it up to measure atmospheric pressure, humidity, and temperature, while the other snipers exchanged glances and wondered what kind of equipment she was using. The tablet screen displayed complex mathematical formulas that scrolled past faster than anyone could read, while Santos made minute adjustments to her rifle scope that required tools most snipers had never seen before. The colonel began to feel the first stirrings of doubt as he realized that Santos was operating with technology and knowledge that exceeded anything he had encountered in his 15 years of commanding sniper units. The 2850-meter target had been placed on the range years earlier as a joke because the distance was considered impossible for practical shooting, but Santos studied it through her scope with the same calm focus she had shown during her weeks of seemingly routine training. The wind patterns at that extreme distance created a complex puzzle of air currents and thermal layers that would require calculations beyond the capability of traditional ballistic charts, but Santos seemed to be solving the problem in real time using methods that none of the observers understood. As Santos made her final preparations, the crowd of spectators grew larger. Because word had spread throughout the base that someone was attempting the impossible shot that had become legendary among the sniper community, the base commander arrived and stood next to Colonel Bradley, asking quietly what was happening while Santos continued her methodical setup process that seemed to involve more science than traditional marksmanship. The colonel found himself unable to explain what he was witnessing because Santos was using techniques that fell outside his understanding of how sniper operations were supposed to work. The CheyTac M200 in Santos' hands had been modified with components that cost more than most soldiers made in a year, and the scope system displayed information that seemed to come from sources beyond the immediate environment. The other snipers began to realize that they were watching something unprecedented as Santos made calculations that treated the 2850-meter shot not as an impossible challenge, but as a complex problem with a definite solution. The wind continued to howl across the desert, but Santos seemed to be incorporating the chaotic air currents into her firing solution rather than waiting for them to calm down. Santos checked her tablet one final time and made a microscopic adjustment to her rifle scope before settling into a firing position that demonstrated training far beyond what the base could provide. The colonel noticed that her breathing pattern and body positioning showed techniques he had never seen before, and he began to suspect that Santos represented something much more significant than a female soldier trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field. The crowd fell silent as Santos prepared to fire because everyone present understood they were about to witness either a spectacular failure or something that would change their understanding of what was possible. The mathematical calculations displayed on Santos' tablet showed ballistic trajectories that accounted for factors most snipers never considered, including the rotation of the Earth and the gravitational effects of nearby mountains. The scope system seemed to be receiving data from external sources that provided real-time atmospheric information along the entire flight path of the bullet rather than just at the firing position. The colonel realized he was watching a demonstration of technology and training that represented the future of precision shooting, while his own methods suddenly seemed primitive and outdated. Santos made one final check of her equipment and looked up at the colonel with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what impact her next shot would have on everyone present. The wind continued to create impossible conditions for long-range shooting, but Santos seemed completely confident that she had solved the complex puzzle of delivering a bullet accurately across nearly 3 kilometers of chaotic desert air. The crowd held its breath as Santos prepared to attempt something that would either confirm the colonel's assumptions about her limitations or shatter his understanding of modern warfare capabilities forever. The CheyTac M200 thundered across the desert as Santos fired, and for several seconds everyone stood in complete silence, waiting to see if the impossible shot had found its mark. The spotter called out a hit and the crowd erupted, but Colonel Bradley demanded to see proof because he refused to believe what had just happened. When they drove out to the 2850-meter target, they found a perfect center mass hit that defied everything. The colonel thought he knew about long-range shooting. Santos calmly removed something from her pocket and handed it to the stunned colonel, explaining that she had been awarded the 2850-meter sniper badge 6 months earlier at a classified competition he knew nothing about. The colonel stared at the badge in disbelief as Santos revealed she had been recruited by a special operations unit that operated beyond his authority, the Drive to the distant target took 15 minutes across rough desert terrain, and with each passing mile, Colonel Bradley felt his certainty crumbling as the reality of what he had witnessed began to sink in. The base commander rode in the passenger seat, asking questions that Bradley could not answer, while the range master sat in the back seat, shaking his head in disbelief at what they were about to confirm. The other snipers followed in a second vehicle, their earlier mockery replaced by stunned silence as they contemplated the implications of Santos' achievement. When they reached the target stand, the evidence was undeniable because the bullet hole was perfectly centered in the vital zone with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Given the extreme distance and harsh wind conditions, the range master measured the shot placement 3 times using different instruments because he could not accept that anyone could achieve such accuracy under the conditions they had just witnessed. Colonel Bradley stood motionless, staring at the target while trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he believed about the limitations of human marksmanship. Santos had remained at the firing line, cleaning her rifle with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout her time at the base, but when the confirmation came over the radio, she simply nodded as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The other snipers gathered around her, asking questions about her equipment and training, but Santos deflected their inquiries with polite responses that revealed nothing about her true background or capabilities. The base armorer arrived and began examining her rifle with obvious fascination, while Santos watched him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating his security clearance level. The 2850-meter sniper badge that Santos handed to Colonel Bradley was unlike anything he had ever seen before because it was manufactured from materials that seemed too advanced for standard military awards and bore markings that indicated classification levels he did not recognize. The badge was warm to the touch, as if it contained electronic components, and the serial number was followed by codes that suggested it was part of a very limited series awarded only to individuals who had achieved something extraordinary. The colonel turned the badge over in his hands while Santos explained that fewer than 20 people in the world possessed the qualification it represented. The classified competition where Santos had earned her badge had taken place at a facility that did not appear on any official military maps and involved challenges that pushed the boundaries of what was considered physically possible. For human marksmen, Santos described shooting scenarios that included moving targets at extreme distances, atmospheric conditions that were artificially manipulated to create maximum difficulty, and time constraints that required split-second decision, making under enormous pressure. The competition had lasted for 2 weeks and eliminated candidates who possessed skills that would have made them legends at conventional sniper schools. Colonel Bradley realized that Santos had been operating at a level of capability that made his entire training program seem like a basic introduction to marksmanship, and his face burned with embarrassment as he understood how thoroughly his prejudices had blinded him to her true nature. The other officers present began to grasp that they were dealing with someone whose skills and clearances exceeded anything they had encountered in their conventional military careers, and the implications of that realization sent shockwaves through their understanding of how special operations actually functioned. Santos revealed that her assignment to the base had been part of an evaluation process that assessed not only the training facilities and equipment, but also the leadership qualities and adaptability of the commanding officers. The Special Operations Unit that had recruited her operated with budgets and authorities that dwarfed conventional military resources, and they were constantly searching for individuals who could perform at levels that seemed impossible to ordinary soldiers. The colonel began to understand that his treatment of Santos had been observed and documented by people whose recommendations could determine the future of his career. The technology integrated into Santos' rifle system represented advances in ballistic science that were years ahead of anything available to conventional military units, and her training had included exposure to weapons and techniques that officially did not exist. The tablet computer she had used for her calculations was connected to satellite networks that provided real-time atmospheric data along the entire flight path of her bullets, while her scope system incorporated targeting algorithms developed by classified research programs. The colonel realized he had been watching a demonstration of capabilities that represented the cutting edge of modern warfare as the group prepared to return to the base. Santos mentioned casually that her current assignment was temporary and that she would be moving on to her next evaluation within the week. The colonel understood that he had missed an opportunity to learn from someone who possessed knowledge and skills that could have revolutionized his training program, but his initial dismissive attitude had eliminated any possibility of meaningful collaboration. Santos had completed her mission at the base, and her report would reflect not only the technical capabilities of the facility, but also the leadership qualities of the personnel she had encountered. The drive back to the firing line was conducted in complete silence, as everyone present contemplated the implications of what they had witnessed and learned. Colonel Bradley stared at the badge in his hands, knowing that it represented achievements that were so far beyond his experience that he could barely comprehend their significance. The desert wind continued to howl across the landscape, but Santos had proven that even the most challenging conditions could be overcome by someone who possessed the right combination of technology training and determination. Colonel Bradley realized he had been testing someone who was already operating at an elite level far beyond anything his unit had ever achieved, and his face flushed red with embarrassment as the other snipers looked at him with barely concealed amusement. Santos explained that her CheyTac M200 modifications were actually classified technology she had been field testing, and her presence at his base was part of a larger evaluation of his training program. The colonel understood that his dismissive attitude had been observed and reported by someone whose recommendations could end his career. Santos shouldered her rifle and walked toward a waiting helicopter that had appeared on the horizon, while the colonel stood frozen, knowing that his ignorance and prejudice had just cost him any chance of advancing in rank. The other snipers watched in stunned silence as Santos disappeared into the aircraft, leaving behind only the impossible target, and a colonel who finally understood that respect must be earned, not assumed. The helicopter that descended onto the desert landing pad bore no identifying markings, but its advanced design and silent approach suggested technology that exceeded standard military aviation capabilities. Colonel Bradley watched helplessly as Santos loaded her equipment into the aircraft with the efficiency of someone who had performed this routine many times before. The pilot remained in the cockpit, but Bradley could see enough of the interior to realize that this was no ordinary military transport, but rather a specialized platform designed for operations that required the highest levels of security and capability. Santos paused at the helicopter door and turned back toward the group of stunned officers and snipers who had gathered to witness her departure. She reached into her gear bag and pulled out a sealed envelope which she handed to Colonel Bradley with instructions that it should be delivered to the base commander within 24 hours. The colonel accepted the envelope with trembling hands, knowing that it contained her evaluation report and recommendations that would determine not only his future, but the future of the entire sniper training program at the facility. The other snipers began asking questions about Santos' equipment and training, but she simply smiled and explained that some information could not be shared due to classification levels that exceeded their security clearances. She mentioned that the technology integrated into her rifle system was still in development, and that her mission had been to evaluate its performance under real-world conditions while simultaneously assessing the quality of training and leadership at various military facilities. The colonel realized that his base had been selected as a test site, not because of its excellence, but because it represented typical conditions found throughout the conventional military. As the helicopter engine spun up to departure speed, Santos revealed that she had been recording data throughout her entire stay at the base, and that her observations would be incorporated into recommendations for improving sniper training programs across all branches of the military. She explained that the future of precision shooting would require integration of advanced technology with enhanced training methods, and that facilities like theirs would need to adapt quickly or risk becoming obsolete. The colonel understood that Santos represented the evolution of warfare into realms that his traditional approach could never reach. The base commander arrived just as Santos was preparing to board the helicopter, and she handed him a data storage device that contained detailed analysis of the facility's strengths and weaknesses, along with specific recommendations for improvements that would bring the program up to modern standards. She explained that the device also contained training materials and technical specifications that could help bridge the gap between current capabilities and future requirements, but warned that implementation would require significant changes in both equipment and mindset. Santos mentioned that her next assignment would take her to another facility where she would conduct similar evaluations, and that her unit was constantly working to identify locations and personnel that showed potential for advancement to higher levels of capability. The colonel realized that he had been given an opportunity to demonstrate leadership and adaptability, but had failed the test through his own prejudices and narrow thinking. The helicopter crew signaled that departure was imminent, and Santos began her final preparations for leaving. The classified badge that Santos had shown to Colonel Bradley was returned to her with instructions that it should never be discussed with anyone who lacked appropriate security clearances. She explained that the competition where she had earned the badge was conducted annually to identify individuals who possessed the rare combination of skills and mental toughness required for the most demanding missions. The colonel understood that he had been in the presence of someone who operated at levels of capability that he could barely imagine, and that his dismissive treatment of her had revealed his own limitations more clearly than any formal evaluation could have done. As Santos climbed into the helicopter, she turned back one final time and told Colonel Bradley that respect in the modern military was earned through performance rather than assumptions, and that leaders who failed to recognize talent, regardless of its source, would find themselves left behind by the rapid pace of technological and tactical evolution. The helicopter lifted off immediately after she secured herself in the passenger compartment, leaving the group of officers and snipers standing in the desert dust, contemplating what they had witnessed. The envelope that Santos had given to Colonel Bradley felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, because he knew it contained an evaluation that would determine whether his career continued or ended in disgrace. The base commander opened the sealed orders that had accompanied Santos' assignment and discovered that her mission had been authorized at levels far above the normal chain of command, and that her recommendations would be implemented regardless of local objections or resistance. Colonel Bradley watched the helicopter disappear into the desert sky, knowing that his world had been fundamentally changed by the encounter with Santos, and that he would spend the rest of his career trying to understand the lessons she had taught him. The other snipers began discussing what they had witnessed, but their conversations were filled with questions that none of them could answer, because Santos had operated in realms that exceeded their experience and imagination. The impossible target remained standing in the desert, as a permanent reminder that the limits of human capability were constantly being redefined by individuals who possessed the vision and determination to push beyond conventional boundaries. Colonel Bradley realized that his assumptions about warfare and leadership had been shattered by someone who represented the future while he remained trapped in the past, and that his only hope for redemption lay in learning from the experience and adapting to the new realities that Santos had revealed.